Hello, hello, hello. How is everyone doing today? It's a cold day in Colorado. Don't know how it is where you are, but today we want to talk about a few thoughts from Ephesians chapter 5, verses 1 through 14. We're not going to be able to cover everything that's in this text, but I've chosen, two or three principles in this text that I want to elaborate upon and want us to think about. Now, whereas chapter 4, verses 25 through chapter 5, verse 2, whereas that text was primarily concerned with practices Christians should adopt, chapter 5, verses 3 through 14 focuses on what should be avoided, right? Sexual sins, sins of the tongue, and covetousness. Let's think first of all about that first topic, sexual sin. You probably know that the word translated fornication in verse 3 is the word porneia, and that's a broad word covering any sexual sin. Again, the word is porneia, and in the New Testament it can refer to incest, promiscuity, sexual relations with a prostitute, or illicit sexual relations. Well, modern Western society virtually idolizes sexuality, wouldn't you say? Obsessed with it, and is loath to recognize boundaries for sexual expression. But of course, lax sexual standards do not fit with Christianity, whether in the first or the 21st century. There is an ethical standard that God wants us to live up to. And we don't want to water this down. We don't want to water down this standard. You know, sometimes I hear someone say, well, the only thing that is important is your heart. Make sure that your heart is right with God because God looks on the heart. Well, God does look on the heart. That's an Old Testament passage. He wants to make sure that our motives are pure and our motives are clean. But that doesn't mean He also does not consider our actions, does it? He does consider our conduct. He does consider our actions. And our actions need to come up to the level of His expectation. He does have an ethical standard for us, one that we don't want to water down, one that we want to insist on. Now, we're going to fail. We're going to fall. We're going to fail to live up to that standard, correct? And that's when God's righteous forgiveness and grace we really come to appreciate those things. But I don't want us to turn loose of this ethical standard because it is here in the New Testament. Let's talk about something else. In verse 5, Paul states that no fornicator or impure person or one who is greedy has any inheritance in God's kingdom. Not only that, but in verse 6, Paul says that God's wrath is coming on the disobedient. Relatively few people in our society, Christians included, take judgment seriously. That's my opinion. My view is that we need balance here. We're talking about God's judgment now, aren't we? That is, we need to return to a focus on God's judgment, while we also preach and teach the grace and forgiveness of God. I had a professor at Oklahoma Christian, Dr. Raymond Kelsey. I thought so much of him, but one of his key words was balance. He preached it. He taught it. He said we should have balance. Well, I don't know that we want to go back to the days of fire and brimstone preaching, but I think today we probably need some balance on this subject. We need to preach and teach the gospel of Jesus Christ, that God offers grace, hope, and forgiveness to all of us through faith in His Son. But we also need to preach that there is such a thing as God's judgment. And Paul talks about that here, doesn't he? Not only will we fail to inherit God's kingdom if we live a certain way, but God's wrath comes down upon those people who choose to live that immoral lifestyle. And then Paul talks about another principle in verses 7 through 11. We'll call this principle separation from the world. He asks that we neither partner with the disobedient nor participate in doing works of darkness. Clearly, participation in sin is excluded, but are we to avoid all contact with sinful people? Is that what Paul is teaching us here? No, I don't think so. Look to the example of Jesus. His biggest conflict was with the religious leaders of his day, but he willingly associated with those who were considered immoral. We often do the reverse, I think. We tolerate inappropriate Christian lifestyles. Well, I should put Christian in quotation marks. We often tolerate those inappropriate Christian lifestyles and then separate from non-Christians? Well, we can't share the gospel of Christ if we separate from unbelievers. The light is to shine in the darkness. The exposing in verse 11 and verse 13 presupposes contact with non-Christians. We separate from sin, not from people. Well, as I said in the beginning, there is certainly more to talk about in this text, but I think this is enough for today. We've talked about moral standards and how God does expect His people to try to live up to those moral standards. We've talked about the surety of God's judgment, and we've also talked about separation from sin and separation from the world. These are important principles. Well, I'll see you again in a few days, and thank you for joining me today. God bless.